from any other earthly person could have meant more to me. But this would be Mr. Muhammad's and my last public appearance together. Not long before, I had been on the Jerry Williams radio program in Boston when someone handed me an item hot off the Associated Press machine. I read that a chapter of the Louisiana Citizens Council had just offered a $10,000 reward for my death. But the threat of death was much closer to me than somewhere in Louisiana. What I am telling you is the truth. When I discovered who else wanted me dead, I'm telling you, it nearly sent me to Bellevue. In my 12 years as a Muslim minister, I had always taught so strongly on the moral issues that many Muslims accused me of being anti-woman. The very keel of my teaching and my most bone-deep personal belief was that Elijah Muhammad in every aspect of his existence was a symbol of moral, mental, and spiritual reform among the American black people. For 12 years, I had taught that within the entire nation of Islam, my own transformation was the best example I knew of until I married. About 12 years later, because of Mr. Muhammad's influence upon me, I had never touched a woman. But around now, if anyone had noticed, spoke less and less. I taught social doctrine to Muslims and current events, politics. I stayed wholly off the subject of morality. And the reason for this was that my faith had been shaken in a way that I can never fully describe. For I had discovered Muslims had been betrayed by Elijah Muhammad himself. I want to make this as brief as I can, only enough so that my position and my reactions will be understood. As to whether or not I should reveal this, there's no longer any need for any question in my mind, for now the public knows. To make it concise, I will quote from one wire service story as it appeared in newspapers and was reported over radio and television across the United States. Los Angeles, July 3rd, UPI. Elijah Muhammad, 67-year-old leader of the black Muslim movement, today faced paternity suit two former secretaries who charged he fathered their 4 children. Both women are in their 20s. Miss Rosary and Miss Williams charged they had intimacies with Elijah Muhammad from 1957 until this year. Miss Rosary alleged he fathered her 2 children and said she was expecting a 3rd child by him. The other plaintiff said he was the father of her daughter. As far back as 1955, I had heard hints, but believe me when I tell you this. For me even to consider believing anything as insane sounding as any slightest implication of any immoral behavior of Mr. Muhammad, why, the very idea made me shake with fear. And so my mind simply refused to accept anything so grotesque as adultery mentioned in the same breath with Mr. Muhammad's name. Adultery. But any Muslim guilty of adultery was summarily ousted in disgrace. One of the nation's most closely kept scandals was that a succession of the personal secretaries of Mr. Muhammad had become pregnant. They were brought before Muslim courts and charged with adultery, and they confessed. Humiliated before the general body, they received sentences from 1 to 5 years of isolation. That meant they were to have no contact whatsoever with any other Muslims. No one in the world could have convinced me that Mr. Muhammad would betray the reverence bestowed upon him by all of those mosques full of poor, trusting Muslims nickeling and diming up to faithfully support the Nation of Islam, when many of those faithful were scarcely able to pay their own rents. But by late 1962, I learned reliably that numerous Muslims were leaving Moscow in Chicago. The ugly rumor was spreading swiftly, even among non-Muslim Negroes. When I thought of how the press constantly sought ways to discredit the Nation of Islam, I trembled to think of such a thing reaching the ears of some newspaper reporter, either black or white. This problem, except Mr. Muhammad himself. Ultimately, that had to be the case. First, I went to Chicago to see Mr. Muhammad's second youngest son, Wallace Muhammad. I felt that Wallace was Mr. Muhammad's most strongly spiritual son, the son with the most objective outlook. Always, Wallace and I had shared an exceptional closeness and trust. And Wallace knew when he saw me why I had come to see him. I know, he said. I said, I thought we should rally to help his father. Wallace said he didn't feel that his father would welcome any efforts to help him. I told myself that Wallace must be crazy. Next, I broke the rule that no Muslim is supposed to have any contact with another Muslim in the isolated state. I looked up and talked with 3 of the former secretaries to Mr. Muhammad. From their own mouths I heard their stories of who had fathered their children. And from their own mouths I heard that Elijah Muhammad had told them I was the best, greatest minister he ever had, but that someday I would leave him, turn against him. So I was dangerous. I learned from these former secretaries of Mr. Muhammad that while he was praising me to my face, he was tearing me apart behind my back. That deeply hurt me. Every day I was meeting the microphones, cameras, press reporters, and other commitments, including the Muslims of my own Mosque 7. I felt almost out of my mind. Finally, the thing crystallized for me. As long as I did nothing, I felt it was the same as being disloyal. I felt that as long as I sat down, I was not helping Mr. Muhammad when somebody needed to be standing up. So one night I wrote to Mr. Muhammad about the poison being spread about it. He telephoned me in New York. He said that when he saw me, he would discuss it. I desperately wanted to find some way, some kind of bridge over which I was certain the Nation of Islam could be saved from self-destruction. I had faith in the nation. We weren't some group of Christian Negroes jumping and shouting and full of sins. I thought of one bridge that could be used if and when the shattering disclosure should become public. Loyal Muslims could be taught that a man's accomplishments in his life outweigh his personal human weaknesses. Wallace Muhammad helped me to review the Quran and the Bible for documentation. David's adultery with Bathsheba weighed less on history scales, for instance, than the positive fact of David's killing Goliath. Thinking of Lot, we think not of incest, but of his saving the people from the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Or, our image of Noah isn't of his getting drunk, but of his building the ark and teaching people to save themselves from the flood. We think of Moses leading the Hebrews from bondage, not of Moses' adultery with the Ethiopian women. In all of the cases I reviewed, the positive outweighed the negative. Elijah Muhammad had me fly to Phoenix to see him in April 1963. We embraced as always, and almost immediately he took me outside where we began to walk by his swimming pool. He was the messenger of Allah. When I was a foul, vicious convict, so evil that other convicts had called me Satan, this man had rescued me. He was the man who had trained me, who had treated me as if I were his own flesh and blood. He was the man who had given me wings to go places, to do things I otherwise never would have dreamed of. We walked, with me caught up in a whirlwind of emotions. "Well, son," Mr. Muhammad said, "what is on your mind?" Plainly, frankly, pulling no punches, I told Mr. Muhammad what was being said. And without waiting for any response from him, I said that with his son Wallace's help, I had found in the Quran and the Bible that which might be taught to Muslims if it became necessary as the fulfillment of prophecy. "Son, I'm not surprised," Elijah Muhammad said. "You always have had such a good understanding of prophecy and of spiritual things. You recognize that's what all of this is. Prophecy. You have the kind of understanding that only an old man has. "I'm David," he said. "When you read about how David took another man's wife, I'm that David. You read about Noah who got drunk. That's me. You read about Lot who went and laid up with his own daughters. I have to fulfill all of those things."
Hoping to ease the blow of their leaders' indiscretions, Malcolm X took it upon himself to tell a select group of East Coast Muslim officials what had happened. Several of them, he discovered, already knew. Then, his attempt to put out the fire exploded in his face. In Chicago, temple officials accused Malcolm X of demeaning the character of Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm was shocked by their reaction, but it was only the first of a succession of revelations. On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Elijah Muhammad immediately issued a directive to his ministers to make no comment concerning the assassination. At a speaking engagement a few days later, Malcolm X was asked his opinion of Kennedy's death. He said what he felt, that it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. The white man's hate, he said, had spread beyond the killing of innocent blacks and now had reached America's president. The climate of hate and violence in America was cited by many world leaders and journalists as a reason for Kennedy's murder. But when Malcolm X said it, the nation's newspapers screamed in outrage, and to Malcolm, it revealed another hard truth. The jealousies that Elijah Muhammad had prophesied were manifest in Elijah Muhammad himself. The Muslim leader seized on Malcolm's Kennedy comment as a reason to first silence and then banish his principal minister. But Malcolm soon learned his ouster was not enough. The Muslims wanted his life.
The first direct order for my death was issued through a Mosque 7 official who previously had been a close assistant. Another previously close assistant of mine was assigned to do the job. He was a brother with a knowledge of demolition. He was asked to wire my car to explode when I turned the ignition key. But this brother, it happened, had seen too much of my loyalty to the nation to carry out his order. Instead, he came to me. I thanked him for my life. I told him what was really going on in Chicago. He was stunned almost beyond belief. This brother was close to others in the Mosque 7 circle who might subsequently be called upon to eliminate me. He said he would take it upon himself to enlighten each of them enough so that they wouldn't allow themselves to be used. This first direct death order was how finally I began to arrive at my psychological divorce from the Nation of Islam. I began to see wherever I went, on the streets, in business places, on elevators, sidewalks, and passing cars, the faces of Muslims whom I knew, and I knew that any of them might be waiting the opportunity to try to put a bullet into me. I was racking my brain. What was I gonna do? My life was inseparably committed to the American black man's struggle. I was generally regarded as a leader. For years, I had attacked so many so-called black leaders for their shortcomings. Now, I had to honestly ask myself what I could offer, how I was genuinely qualified to help the black people win their struggle for human rights. I had enough experience to know that in order to be a good organizer of anything which you expect to succeed, including yourself, you must almost mathematically analyze cold facts. I had, as one asset I knew, an international image. No amount of money could have bought that. I knew that if I said something newsworthy, people would read or hear of it, maybe even around the world, depending on what it was. More immediately in New York City, where I would naturally base any operation, I had a large, direct personal following of non-Muslims. I knew that the great lack of most of the big-named Negro leaders was their lack of any true rapport with the ghetto Negroes. How could they have rapport when they spent most of their time integrating with white people? I knew that the ghetto people knew that I never left the ghetto in spirit, and I never left it physically any more than I had to. I had a ghetto instinct. For instance, I could feel if tension was beyond normal in a ghetto audience, and I could speak and understand the ghetto's language. There was an example of this that always flew into my mind every time I heard some of the big-name Negro leaders declaring they spoke for the ghetto black people. After a Harlem street rally, one of these downtown leaders and I were talking when we were approached by a Harlem hustler. To my knowledge, I'd never seen this hustler before. He said to me approximately, "Hey, baby, I dig you holding this all-original scene at the track. I'm going to lay a vine under the Jew's balls for a dime. Got to give you a play. Got the shorts out here trying to scuffle up on some bread. Well, my man, I'll get on. Got to go peck a little and cop me some Z's." And the hustler went on up 7th Avenue. I never would have given it another thought except that this downtown leader was standing, staring after that hustler, looking as if he just heard Sanskrit. He asked me what had been said, and I told him. The hustler had said he was aware that the Muslims were holding an all-black bazaar at Rockland Palace, which is primarily a dance hall. The hustler intended to pawn a suit for $10 to attend and patronize the bazaar. He had very little money, but he was trying hard to make some. He was going to eat, then he would get some CBS or NBC microphones at Harvard or at Tuskegee. I could talk with the so-called middle-class Negro and with the ghetto blacks, whom all the other leaders just talked about. And because I had been a hustler, I knew better than all whites knew, and nearly all the black leaders knew, that actually the most dangerous black man in America was the ghetto hustler. Why do I say this? The hustler out there in the ghetto jungles has less respect for the white power structure than any other Negro in North America. The ghetto hustler is internally restrained by nothing. He has no religion, no concept of morality, no civic responsibility, no fear, nothing. To survive, he is out there constantly preying upon others, probing for any human weaknesses like a ferret. The ghetto hustler is forever frustrated, restless, and anxious for some action. Whatever he undertakes, he commits himself to it fully, absolutely. What makes the ghetto hustler yet more dangerous is his glamour image to the school dropout youth in the ghetto. These ghetto teenagers see the hell caught by their parents struggling to get somewhere, or see that they have given up struggling in the prejudiced, intolerant white man's world. The ghetto teenagers make up their own minds that they would rather be like the hustler, who they see dressed sharp and flashing money and displaying no respect for anybody or anything. So the ghetto youth become attracted to the hustler worlds of dope, thievery, prostitution, and general crime and immorality. It scared me the first time I really saw the danger of these ghetto teenagers if ever sparked into violence. One sweltering summer afternoon, I attended a Harlem street rally which contained a lot of these teenagers in the crowd. I had been invited by some responsible Negro leaders who normally never spoke to me. I knew they had just used my name to help them draw a crowd. The more I thought about it on the way there, the hotter I got. And when I got on the stand, I just told the crowd in the street that I wasn't really that my name had been used, and I walked off the stand. Well, what did I want to do that for? Those young teenage Negroes got upset and started milling around and yelling, upsetting the old and out. The first thing you know, traffic was blocked in 4 directions by a crowd whose mood quickly grew so that I really got apprehensive. I got on top of a car and began waving my arm, yelling at them to quiet down. They did quiet. And then I asked them to disperse, and they did. This was when it began being said that I was America's only Negro who could stop a race riot cold or start one. I don't know if I could do either one, but I know one thing. It had taught me in a very few minutes to have a whole lot of respect for the human combustion that is packed among the hustlers and the young admirers who live in the ghettos where the northern white man has sealed off the Negro. away from white for 100 years. I reasoned that the decision already had been made for me. I felt a challenge to plan and build an organization that could help to cure the black man in North America of the sickness which has kept him under the white man's heel. Substantially, as I saw it, the organization I hoped to build was Islam in that it would embrace all faiths of black men and would carry into practice what the Nation of Islam had only preached. Rumors were swirling, particularly in East Coast cities. What was I going to do? Well, the first thing I was going to have to do was to attract far more willing hands and heads than my own. Each day, more militant action brothers who had been with me in Mosque 7 announced their break from the Nation of Islam to come with me. And each day I learned in one or another way of more support from non-Muslim Negroes, including a surprising lot of the middle and upper-class black bourgeoisie who were sick of the status symbol charade. There was a growing clamor. When are you going to call a meeting to get organized? To hold the first meeting, I arranged to rent the Carver Ballroom at the Hotel Teresa, which is at the corner of 125th Street and 7th Avenue, which might be called one of Harlem's fuse box locations. The Amsterdam News reported the planned meeting, and many readers inferred that we were establishing our beginning mosque in the Teresa. Telegrams and letters and telephone calls came to the hotel for me from across the country. The general tone was that this was a move that people had waited for. People I'd never heard of expressed confidence in me in moving ways. Numerous people said that the Nation of Islam's stringent moral restrictions had repelled them, and they wanted to join me. Astonishing numbers of white people called and wrote offering contributions or asking could they join. The answer was no, they couldn't join. Our membership was all black, but if their consciences dictated, they could financially help our constructive approach to America's race problem. Speaking engagement requests came in, 22 of them in one particular Monday morning's mail. It was startling to me that an unusual number of the requests came from groups of white Christian ministers. I called a press conference. The microphone stuck up before me. The flashbulbs popped. The reporters, men and women, white and black, representing media that reached around the world, sat looking at me with their pencils and open notebooks. I made the announcement. I am going to organize and head a new mosque in New York City known as the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. This will give us a religious base and a spiritual force necessary to rid our people of the vices that destroy the moral fiber of our community. Muslim Mosque Incorporated will have its temporary headquarters in the Hotel Teresa in Harlem. It will be the working base for an action program designed to eliminate the political oppression, the economic exploitation, and the social degradation suffered daily by 22 million Afro-Americans. Then the reporters began firing questions at me. It was not all as simple as it may sound. I went few places without constant awareness that any number of my former brothers felt they would make heroes of themselves in the Nation of Islam if they killed me. I knew how Elijah Muhammad's followers thought. I had taught so many of them to think. I knew that no one would kill you quicker than a Muslim if he felt that's what Allah wanted him to do. There was one further major preparation that I knew I needed. I'd had it in mind for a long time, as a servant of Allah, but it would require money that I didn't have. I took a plane to Boston. I was turning again to my sister Ella. Though at times I'd made Ella angry at me beneath it all, since I had first come to her as a teenage hick from Michigan, Ella had never once really wavered from my corner. Ella, I said, I want to make the pilgrimage to Mecca. Ella said, how much do you need?
Malcolm X's life was characterized by sudden, dramatic change. From small-town boy to big-city hustler, from convict to worldwide prominence as a leader of and spokesman for his people. His pilgrimage to Mecca would inspire one more seminal change. For the first time in his life, everyone he met, from statesmen to shepherds, treated him as an equal, as a fellow human being, without regard for the color of his skin. All along his journey, he met people, black, brown, white, red, and yellow people, who helped him realize his dream. In New York, Dr. Mahmoud Youssef Chouabi, a professor at the University of Cairo and a United Nations advisor, gave him a signed letter approving his pilgrimage as required by the Saudi Arabian consulate. Dr. Chouabi also gave Malcolm a book, The Eternal Message of Muhammad. He told Malcolm that the book's author, Abdul Ar-Rahman Assam, was a close advisor of the Arabian ruler, Prince Faisal. Assam, he said, had followed the stories of Malcolm X in the press closely. It was the first of many signs, Malcolm felt, that Allah was with him. His experience in Mecca awakened in Malcolm a feeling he had never known, a sense of idealism, of hope that perhaps after all, people could live together as brothers. While still in Mecca, he summed up his experience and his feelings in a letter.
I have reflected since that the letter I finally sat down to compose had been subconsciously shaping itself in my mind. The colorblindness of the Muslim world's religious society and the colorblindness of the Muslim world's human society, these two influences had each day been making a greater impact and an increasing persuasion against my previous way of thinking. The first letter was, of course, to my wife, Betty. I never had a moment's question that Betty, after initial amazement, would change her thinking to join mine. I had known 1,000 reassurances that Betty's faith in me was total. I knew that she would see what I had seen, that in the land of Muhammad and the land of Abraham, I had been blessed by Allah with new insight into the true religion of Islam and a better understanding of America's entire racial dilemma. After the letter to my wife, I wrote next essentially the same letter to my sister Ella, and I knew where Ella would stand. She had been saving to make the pilgrimage to Mecca herself. I wrote to Dr. Chouabi, whose belief in my sincerity had enabled me to get a passport to Mecca. All through the night, I copied similar long letters for others who were very close to me. Among them was Elijah Muhammad's son, Wallace Muhammad, who had expressed to me his conviction that the only possible salvation for the nation of Islam would be its accepting and projecting a better understanding of Orthodox Islam. And I wrote to my loyal assistants at my newly formed Muslim Mosque Incorporated in Harlem, with a note appended asking that my letter be duplicated and distributed to the press. I knew that when my letter became public knowledge back in America, many would be astounded, loved ones, friends, and enemies alike. And no less astounded would be millions whom I did not know, who had gained during my 12 years with Elijah Muhammad a hate image of Malcolm X. Even I was myself astounded. But there was a precedent in my life for this letter. My whole life has been a chronology of changes. Here's what I wrote from my heart. Never have I witnessed such sincere hospitality and the overwhelming spirit of true brotherhood as is practiced by people of all colors and races here in this ancient holy land, the home of Abraham, Muhammad, and all the other prophets and of the Holy Scriptures. For the past week I have been utterly speechless and spellbound by the graciousness I see displayed all around me by people of all colors. I have been blessed to visit the holy city of Mecca. I have made my 7 circuits around the Kaaba, led by a young mutawaf named Muhammad. I drank water from the well of Zemzem. I ran 7 times back and forth between the hills of Mount Asafa and Al-Marwa. I have prayed in the ancient city of Mina, and I have prayed on Mount Arafat. There were tens of thousands of pilgrims from all over the world. They were of all colors, from blue-eyed blondes to black-skinned Africans. But we were all participating in the same ritual, displaying a spirit of unity and brotherhood that my experiences in America had led me to believe never could exist between the white and the non-white. America needs to understand Islam, because this is the one religion that erases from its society the race problem. Throughout my travels in the Muslim world, I have met, talked to, and even eaten with people who in America would have been considered white. But the white attitude was removed from their minds by the religion of Islam. I have never before seen sincere and true brotherhood practiced by all colors together, irrespective of their color. You may be shocked by these words coming from me, but on this pilgrimage, what I have seen and experienced has forced me to rearrange much of my thought patterns previously held, and to toss aside some of my previous conclusions. During the past 11 days here in the Muslim world, I have eaten from the same plate, drunk from the same glass, and slept in the same bed or on the same rug while praying to the same God with fellow Muslims whose eyes were the bluest of blue, whose hair was the blondest of blonde, and whose skin was the whitest of white. And in the words and in the actions and in the deeds of the white Muslims, I felt the same sincerity that I felt among the black African Muslims of Nigeria, Sudan, and Ghana. We were truly all the same, brothers, because their belief in one God had removed the white from their minds, the white from their behavior, and the white from their attitude. I could see from this that perhaps if white Americans could accept the oneness of God, then perhaps, too, they could accept in reality the oneness of man, and cease to measure and hinder and harm others in terms of their differences in color. Each hour here in the Holy Land enables greater spiritual insights into what is happening in America with black and white. The American Negro can never be blamed for his racial animosities. He's only reacting to 400 years of the conscious racism of American whites. But as racism leads America up this path, I do believe from the experiences that I have had with them that the whites of the younger generation in the colleges and universities will see the handwriting on the wall, and many of them will turn to the spiritual path of truth, the only way left to America to ward off the disaster that racism inevitably must lead to. Never have I been so highly honored. Never have I been made to feel more humble and unworthy. Who would believe the blessings that have been heaped upon an American Negro? A few nights ago, a man would be called in America a white man, a United Nations diplomat, an ambassador, a companion of kings, gave me his hotel suite, his bed. By this man, His Excellency Prince Faisal, who rules this holy land, was made aware of my presence here in Jeddah. The very next morning, Prince Faisal's son, in person, informed me that by the will and decree of his esteemed father, I was to be a state guest. The Deputy Chief of Protocol himself took me before the Hajj court. His Holiness Sheikh Muhammad Harkoon himself okayed my visit to Mecca. His Holiness gave me 2 books on Islam with his personal seal and autograph, and he told me that he prayed that I would be a successful preacher of Islam in America. A car, a driver, and a guide have been placed at my disposal, making it possible for me to travel about this holy land almost at will. The government provides air-conditioned quarters and servants in each city that I visit. Never would I have even thought of dreaming that I would ever be a recipient of such honors. Honors that in America would be bestowed upon a king, not a Negro. All praise is due to Allah, the Lord of all the worlds. Sincerely, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X.
When his pilgrimage was over, Malcolm X did not go directly home. He went instead to Lebanon, and from there back to Egypt, and then to Nigeria and Ghana. At all of these stops, he was treated as a visiting dignitary. He addressed students at leading universities and met with heads of state. And he was again struck by what was missing from these African cultures, the racial hatred that permeated the United States. He celebrated his 39th birthday in Algiers, waiting for his flight back to America. It would be his final birthday.
The Pan American jet which took me home, it was Flight 115, landed at New York's Kennedy Air Terminal on May 21st at 4:25 in the afternoon. We passengers filed off the plane and toward customs. When I saw the crowd of 50 or 60 reporters and photographers, I honestly wondered what celebrity I had been on the plane with. But I was the villain they had come to meet. In Harlem especially, and also in some other U.S. cities, the 1964 long, hot summer's predicted explosions had begun. Article after article in the white man's press had cast me as a symbol, if not a causative agent, of the revolt and of the violence of the American black man wherever it had sprung up. In the biggest press conference that I had ever experienced anywhere, the camera bulbs flashed and the reporters fired questions. Mr. Malcolm X, what about those blood brothers reportedly affiliated with your organization, reportedly trained for violence, who have killed innocent white people? Mr. Malcolm X, what about your comment that Negroes should form rifle clubs? I answered the questions. I knew I was back in America again, hearing the subjective, scapegoat-seeking questions of the white man. New York white youth were killing victims. That was a sociological problem. But when black youth killed somebody, the power structure was looking to hang somebody. When black men had been lynched or otherwise murdered in cold blood, it was always said, things will get better. When whites had rifles in their homes, the Constitution gave them the right to protect their home and themselves. But when black people even spoke of having rifles in their homes, that was ominous. I slipped in on the reporters something they hadn't been expecting. I said that the American black man needed to quit thinking what the white man had taught him, which was that the black man had no alternative except to beg for his so-called civil rights. I said that the American black man needed to recognize that he had a strong, airtight case to take to the United States before the United Nations on a formal accusation of denial of human rights, and that if Angola and South Africa were precedent cases, then there would be no easy way that the United States could escape being censored right on its own home ground. Just as I had known, the press wanted to get me off that subject. I was asked about my letter from Mecca. I was all set with a speech regarding that. I hope that once and for all my Hajj to the holy city of Mecca has established our Muslim mosques' authentic religious affiliation with the 750 million Muslims of the Orthodox Islamic world. And I know once and for all that the black Africans look upon America's 22 million blacks as long-lost brothers. They love us. They study our struggle for freedom. They were so happy to hear how we are awakening from our long sleep after so-called Christian white America had taught us to be ashamed of our African brothers and homeland. Yes, I wrote a letter from Mecca. You're asking me, didn't you say that now you accept white men as brothers? Well, my answer is that in the Muslim world I saw, I felt, and I wrote home how my thinking was broadened. Just as I wrote, I shared true brotherly love with many white-complexioned Muslims who never gave a single thought to the race or to the complexion of another Muslim. It was in the holy world that my attitude was changed by what I experienced there. by what I witnessed there in terms of brotherhood. Not just brotherhood toward me, but brotherhood between all men, of all nationalities and complexions, who were there. And now that I am back in America, my attitude here concerning white people has to be governed by what my black brothers and I experience here, and what we witness here in terms of brotherhood. The problem here in America is that we meet such a small minority of individual so-called good or brotherly white people. Here in the States, notwithstanding those few good white people, it is the collective 150 million white people whom the 22 million black people have to deal with. While here in America, the seeds of racism are so deeply rooted in the white people collectively, their belief that they are superior in some way is so deeply rooted that these things are in the national white subconsciousness. Many whites are even actually unaware of their own racism until they face some test, and then their racism emerges in one form or another. Listen, the white man's racism toward the black man here in America is what has got him in such trouble all over this world with other non-white peoples. The white man can't separate himself from the stigma that he automatically feels about anyone, no matter who is not his color. And the non-white peoples of the world are sick of the condescending white man. That's why you've got all this trouble in places like Vietnam or right here in the Western Hemisphere. Probably 100 million people of African descent are divided against each other, taught by the white man to hate and to mistrust each other. In the West Indies, Cuba, Brazil, Venezuela, all of South America, Central America, all of those lands are full of people with African blood. On the African continent even, the white man has maneuvered to divide the black African from the brown Arab, to divide the so-called Christian African from the Muslim African. Can you imagine what can happen? What would certainly happen if all these African heritage people ever realize their blood bonds, if they ever realize they all have a common goal, if they ever unite. The press was glad to get rid of me that day. I believe that the black brothers whom I had just recently left in Africa would have felt that I did the subject justice. Nearly through the night, my telephone at home kept ringing. My black brothers and sisters around New York and some other cities were calling to congratulate me on what they had heard on the radio and television news broadcasts. And people, mostly white, were wanting to know if I would speak here or there. The next day, I was in my car driving along the freeway when at a red light another car pulled alongside. A white woman was driving, and on the passenger's side next to me was a white man. "Malcolm X," he called out. And when I looked, he stuck his hand out of his car across at me, grinning. "Do you mind shaking hands with a white man?" Imagine that. Just as the traffic light turned green, I told him, "I don't mind shaking hands with human beings. Are you one?" One of the major troubles I was having in building the organization I wanted, an all-black organization whose ultimate objective was to help create a society in which there could exist honest white-black brotherhood, was that my earlier public image, my old so-called black Muslim image, kept blocking me. I was trying to gradually reshape that image. I was trying to turn a corner into a new regard by the public, especially Negroes. I was no less angry than I had been, but at the same time, the true brotherhood I had seen in the Holy Land had influenced me to recognize that anger can blind human vision. Every free moment I could find, I did a lot of talking to key people whom I knew around Harlem, and I made a lot of speeches saying, "True Islam taught me that it takes all of the religious, political, economic, psychological, and racial ingredients, all characteristics, to make the human family and the human society complete." I said to Harlem street audiences that only when mankind would submit to the one God who created all Only then would mankind even approach the peace of which so much talk could be heard, but toward which so little action was seen. I said that on the American racial level, we had to approach the black man's struggle against the white man's racism as a human problem, that we had to forget hypocritical politics and propaganda. I said that both races, as human beings, had the obligation, the responsibility of helping to correct America's human problem. The well-meaning white people, I said, had to combat directly the racism in other ways, and the black people had to build within themselves much greater awareness that along with equal right had to be the bearing of equal responsibilities. I knew better than most Negroes how many white people truly wanted to see American racial problems solved. I knew that many whites were as frustrated as Negroes. I'll bet I got 50 letters some days from white people. The white people in meeting audiences would throng around me asking me after I had addressed them somewhere, what can a sincere white person do? The first thing I tell them is that at least where my own particular black nationalist organization, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, is concerned, they can't join us. I have these very deep feelings that white people who want to join black organizations are really just taking the escapist way to salve their consciences. By visibly hovering near us, they are proving that they are with us. But the hard truth is, this isn't helping to solve America's racist problem. The Negroes aren't the racists. Where the really sincere white people have got to do their proving of themselves is not among the black victims, but out on the battle lines of where America's racism really is, and that's in their own home communities. America's racism is among their own fellow whites. That's where the sincere whites who really mean to accomplish something have got to work. Aside from that, I mean nothing against any sincere whites when I say that as members of black organizations, generally whites' very presence subtly renders the black organization automatically less effective. Even the best white members will slow down the Negroes' discovery of what they need to do, and particularly of what they can do for themselves, working by themselves among their own kind in their own communities. I tell sincere white people, work in conjunction with us, each of us working among our own kind. Let sincere white individuals find all other white people they can who feel as they do, and let them form their own all-white groups to work trying to convert other white people who are thinking and acting so racist. Let sincere whites go and teach nonviolence to white people. We will completely respect our white co-workers. They will deserve every credit. We will give them every credit. We will meanwhile be working among our own kind in our own black communities, showing and teaching black men in ways that only other black men can, that the black man has got to help himself. Working separately, the sincere white people and sincere black people actually will be working together. In our mutual sincerity, we might be able to show a road to the salvation of America's very soul. It can only be salvaged if human rights and dignity in full are extended to black men. Only such real, meaningful actions as those which are sincerely motivated from a deep sense of humanism and moral responsibility can get at the basic causes that produce the racial explosions in America today. Otherwise, the racial explosions are only going to grow worse. Certainly nothing is going to be solved by throwing upon me or other so-called black extremists and demagogues the blame for the racism that is in America. Sometimes I have dared to dream to myself that one day history may even say that my voice, which disturbed the white man's smugness and his arrogance and his complacency, that my voice helped to save America from a grave, possibly even a fatal catastrophe. The goal has always been the same, but the approaches to it as different as mine and Dr. Martin Luther King's nonviolent marching that dramatized the brutality and the evil of the white man against defenseless blacks. And in the racial climate of this country today, it is anybody's guess which of the extremes in approach to the black man's problems might personally meet a fatal catastrophe first: nonviolent Dr. King or so-called violent me. Anything I do today, I regard as urgent. No man is given but so much time to accomplish whatever is his life's work. My life, in particular, never has stayed fixed in any one position for very long. You have seen how throughout my life I've often known unexpected, drastic changes. I am only facing the facts when I know that any moment of any day or any night could bring me death. This is particularly true since the last trip that I made abroad. I've seen the nature of things that are happening, and I have heard things from sources which are reliable. To speculate about dying doesn't disturb me as it might some people. I've never felt that I would live to become an old man. Even before I was a Muslim, when I was a hustler in the ghetto jungle and then a criminal in prison, it always stayed on my mind that I would die a violent death. In fact, it runs in my family. My father and most of his brothers died by violence, my father because of what he believed in. To come right down to it, if I take the kind of things in which I believe, then add to that the kind of temperament that I have, plus the 100% dedication I have to whatever I believe in, these are ingredients which make it just about impossible for me to die of old age. I have given to this book so much of whatever time I have because I feel and I hope that if I honestly and fully tell my life's account, read objectively, it might prove to be a testimony of some social value. I think that an objective reader may see how in the society to which I was exposed as a black youth here in America, for me to wind up in prison was really just about inevitable. It happens to so many thousands of black youth. I think that an objective reader may see how when I heard the white man is the devil, when I played back what had been my own experiences, it was inevitable that I would respond positively. Then the next 12 years of my life were devoted and dedicated to propagating that phrase among black people. I think, I hope, that the objective reader in following my life, the life of only one ghetto-created Negro, may gain a better picture and understanding than he has previously had of the black ghettos, which are shaping the life and the thinking of almost all of the 22 million Negroes who live in America. Thicker each year in these kind of teenager that I was, the wrong kinds of heroes and the wrong kinds of influences. I'm not saying that all of them become the kind of parasite that I was. Fortunately, by far, most do not. But still, the small fraction who do add up to an annual total of more and more costly, dangerous, youthful criminals. The FBI not long ago released a report of a shocking rise in crime each successive year since the end of World War II, 10 to 12% each year. The report did not say so in so many words, but I am saying that the majority of that crime increase is annually spawned in the black ghettos which the American racist society permits to exist. In the 1964 long, hot summer riots in major cities across the United States, the socially disinherited black ghetto youth were always at the forefront. In this year, 1965, I am certain that more and worse riots are going to erupt in yet more cities in spite of the conscience-salving Civil Rights Bill. The reason is that the cause of these riots, the racist malignancy in America, has been too long unattended. I believe that it would be almost impossible to find anywhere in America a black man who has lived further down in the mud of human society than I have. or a black man who has been any more ignorant than I have been, or a black man who has suffered more anguish during his life than I have. But it is only after the deepest darkness that the greatest joy can come. It is only after slavery and prison that the sweetest appreciation of freedom can come. For the freedom of my 22 million black brothers and sisters here in America, I do believe that I have fought the best that I know how, and the best that I could, with the shortcomings that I have had. I know that my shortcomings are many. My greatest lack has been, I believe, that I don't have the kind of academic education I wish I had been able to get, to have been a lawyer perhaps. I do believe that I might have been a good lawyer. I've always loved verbal battle and challenge. You can believe me that if I had the time right now, I would not be one bit ashamed to go back into any New York City public school and start where I left off in 9th grade and go on through a degree. Because I don't begin to be academically equipped for so many of the interests that I have. For instance, I love languages. I wish I were an accomplished linguist. I don't know anything more frustrating than to be around people talking something you can't understand, especially when there are people who look like you. In Africa, I heard original mother tongues such as Hausa and Swahili being spoken, and there I was standing like some little boy waiting for someone to tell me what had been said. I never will forget how ignorant I felt. Every morning when I wake up now, I regard it as having another borrowed day. In any city, wherever I go, making speeches, holding meetings of my organization, or attending to other business, black men are watching every move I make, awaiting their chance to kill me. I have said publicly many times that I know they have their orders. Anyone who chooses not to believe what I am saying doesn't know the Muslims in the Nation of Islam. But I am also blessed with faithful followers who are, I believe, as dedicated to me as I once was to Mr. Elijah Muhammad. Those who would hunt a man need to remember that a jungle also contains those who hunt the hunters. I know, too, that I could suddenly die at the hands of some white racists, or I could die at the hands of some Negro hired by the white man. Or it could be some brainwashed Negro acting on his own idea that by eliminating me, he would be helping out the white man because I talk about the white man the way I do. Anyway, now, each day I live as if I am already dead. And I tell you what I would like for you to do. When I am dead, and I say it that way because from the things I know, I do not expect to live long enough to read this book in its finished form. I want you to just watch and see if I'm not right in what I say. That the white man in his press is going to identify me with hate. He will make use of me dead as he has made use of me alive as a convenient symbol of hatred. And that will help him to escape facing the truth. That all I have been doing is holding up a mirror to reflect, to show the history of unspeakable crimes that his race has committed against my race. You watch. I will be labeled as, at best, an irresponsible black man. I've always felt about this accusation that the black leader whom white men consider to be responsible is invariably the black leader who never gets any results. You can only get action as a black man if you are regarded by the white man as irresponsible. In fact, this much I had learned when I was just a little boy. And since I have been some kind of a leader of black people here in the racist society of America, I have been more reassured each time the white man resisted me or attacked me harder, because each time made me more certain that I was on the right track in the American black man's best interests. The racist white man's opposition automatically made me know that I did offer the black man something worthwhile. Yes, I have cherished my demagogue role. I know that societies often have killed the people who have helped to change those societies. And if I can die having brought any light, having exposed any meaningful truth that will help to destroy the racist cancer that is malignant in the body of America, then all of the credit is due to Allah. Only the mistakes have been mine.
Malcolm X, who was now El-Hajj El-Shabazz, spent months following his Mecca, building his new organization of Afro-American unity and delivering his message of hope. True Islam, he told his audiences, taught me that it takes all of the religious, political, economic, psychological, and racial ingredients or characteristics to make the human family and the human society complete. In spite of a rash of death threats, he kept up his schedule, traveling across the country and to Europe and again to Africa. On Saturday, February 14th, 1965, flaming gasoline bombs were hurled through the front window of his home, virtually destroying it. Malcolm and his family barely escaped. He arranged for emergency housing and rearranged his schedule so he and Sister Betty could find a new home. A week later, they did find one, and Malcolm asked for advances from the publisher of his autobiography so they could make the down payment and move in. He didn't live to make the move. On Sunday, February 21st, Malcolm X was assassinated at the Audubon Ballroom in New York City. He had just been introduced to the audience and had issued his familiar greeting, "Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters." A scuffle erupted near the front of the crowd, and as the audience's attention was diverted to it, several gunmen stood up in the front row and opened fire. Eyewitnesses also reported seeing two men rushing toward the stage, one with a shotgun, the other with two revolvers. Malcolm X clutched his chest as the bullets hit him and toppled backwards, stiffly. Malcolm X's wife and daughters were there that day. After throwing her body over her shrieking children, Sister Betty scrambled up and ran to her fallen husband's side, crying, "My husband, they're killing my husband." Two people tried to administer artificial respiration. It was futile. As Sister Betty came through the crowd on stage, they moved aside. She fell to her knees next to his body, sobbing, "They killed him." The body of Malcolm X was scheduled to go on public view on Tuesday at 2:30 p.m. at the Unity Funeral Home in Harlem on the east side of 8th Avenue between 126th and 127th Streets. At 2:15 that morning, an explosion and fire destroyed Muslim Mosque Number 7, along with 7 street-level stores around it, including the Muslim restaurant. At the funeral home, telephone bomb threats began coming in around noon, and the crowds that had been standing behind police barricades waiting to view the body were not allowed in until after 7 in the evening. In the next few hours, 2,000 people filed past the open coffin. By the time the doors closed late Friday night, an estimated 22,000 people had viewed the body. The viewing was interrupted for a time on Friday afternoon with the arrival of Sheikh Ahmed Hassan and his party. Hassan, a Sunni Muslim who had met Malcolm X in Mecca and had come to the United States to serve as his spiritual advisor, was not there to simply view the body, but to prepare it for burial in accordance with the Muslim ritual. He removed the dark suit that had clothed Malcolm's body and washed the body in holy oil. Then he draped the body in 7 white linen shrouds so that only the face was visible. After he read passages from the Quran, he told the funeral home representative, "Now the body is ready for burial." The funeral at the Faith Temple at 147th Street and Amsterdam Avenue drew thousands more. People began gathering at 6 a.m. in the February cold. It was a Christian church, but no Christian symbols were in view. Any hint of Christianity in the services would make the deceased a kafir, an unbeliever. Actor Ossie Davis and his wife Ruby Dee read notes, telegrams, and cables of condolence from around the world. Omar Osman, a representative of the Islam Center of Switzerland and the United States, drew applause when he said, "The highest thing that a Muslim can aspire to is to die on the battlefield and not die at his bedside. Those who die on the battlefield are not dead, but are alive." Then Ossie Davis stood again, and this was his eulogy to Malcolm X. Here, at this final hour, in this quiet place, Harlem has come to bid farewell to one of its brightest hopes, extinguished now and gone from us forever. Many will ask what Harlem finds to honor in this stormy, controversial, and bold young captain, and we will smile. They will say that young ones, but we live for, we die for, we live for forever. Young ones, but we live for, we live for, we live. He is of hate, a fanatic, a racist, who can only bring evil to the cause for which you struggle. And we will answer and say unto them, did you ever talk to Brother Malcolm? Did you ever touch him or have him smile at you? Did you ever really listen to him? For if you did, you would know him. And if you knew him, you would know why we must honor him. Malcolm was our manhood, our living black manhood. This was his meaning to his people, and in honoring him, we honor the best in ourselves, and we will know him then and is a prince, our own black, shining prince, who didn't hesitate to die because he loved us so. Malcolm X was buried at Cliff Cemetery in Ardsley, New York, about 18 miles outside of Manhattan. As the 80-plus cars of the funeral cortege drove by, African Americans all along the route placed their hands or their hats over their hearts, paying final respects. Here are the final words of Alex Haley's epilogue to the autobiography of Malcolm X. The night fell over the earthly remains of El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, who had been called Malcolm X, who had been called Malcolm Little, who had been called Detroit Red, and Satan, and Homeboy, and other names, who had been buried as a Muslim. According to the Quran, the New York Times reported, the bodies of the dead remain in their graves until the last day, the day of judgment. On this day of cataclysm, the heavens are rent, and the mountains ground to dust, the graves open, and men are called to account by Allah. The blessed, the God-fearing, the humble, the charitable, those who have suffered and been persecuted for Allah's sake, or fought in religious wars for Islam, are summoned to the Garden of Paradise. There, according to the teaching of Muhammad the Prophet, they live forever by flowing streams, reclining on silken cushions, and enjoying the company of dark-eyed maidens and wives of perfect purity. The damned, the covetous, the evildoer, the follower of gods other than Allah, are sent to eternal fire, where they are fed boiling water and molten brass. The death from which ye flee will truly overtake you, the Quran says. Then will ye be sent back to the knower of things secret and open, and he will tell you the truth of the things that ye did. After signing the contract for this book, Malcolm X looked at me hard. A writer is what I want, not an interpreter. I tried to be a dispassionate chronicler, but he was the most electric personality I have ever met, and I still can't quite conceive him dead. It still feels to me as if he has just gone into some next chapter to be written by historians.
The Autobiography of Malcolm X was read by Joe Morton with narration by Roscoe Lee Brown. It was abridged for audio by Jesse Boggs. Directing consultation by Greg Totlin. The recording engineer was Phil Sibley with post-production by Leszek Wojcik. Original music by Daniel Carter. The associate producer was Elisa Shokoff. A special thanks to Paul Winley of Paul Winley Records in New York, Joan Franklin of Cinema Sound in New York, and Dennis Dalton, all of whom contributed their time and expertise to this production. The Autobiography of Malcolm X was produced and directed by Susan Perrin.
The Autobiography of Malcolm X, as told to Alex Haley.
When my mother was pregnant with me, she told me later, a party of hooded Ku Klux Klan riders galloped up to our home in Omaha, Nebraska one night. Surrounding the house, brandishing their guns and rifles, they shouted for my father to come out. My mother went to the front door and opened it. Standing where they could see her pregnant condition, she told them that she was alone with 3 small children and that my father was away preaching in Milwaukee. The Klansmen shouted threats and warnings at her that we had better get out of town because the good Christian white people were not going to stand for my father spreading trouble among the good Negroes of Omaha with the back to Africa preachings of Marcus Garvey. My father, the Reverend Earl Little, was a Baptist minister, a dedicated organizer for Marcus Aurelius Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association. With the help of such disciples as my father, Garvey, from his headquarters in New York City's Harlem, was raising the banner of black race purity and exhorting the Negro masses to return to their ancestral African homeland, a cause which had made Garvey the most controversial black man on earth. Still shouting threats, the Klansmen finally spurred their horses and galloped around the house, shattering every window pane with their gun butts. Then they rode off into the night, their torches flaring as suddenly as they had come. My father was enraged when he returned. He decided to wait until I was born, which would be soon, and then the family would move. I'm not sure why he made this decision, for he was not a frightened Negro, as most then were, and many still are today. My father was a big 6'4", very black man. He had only one eye. How he'd lost the other one eye, I've never known. He was from Reynolds, Georgia, where he had left school after the 3rd or maybe 4th grade. He believed, as did Marcus Garvey, that freedom, independence, and self-respect could never be achieved by the Negro in America, and that therefore the Negro should leave America to the white man and return to his African land of origin. Among the reasons my father had decided to risk and dedicate his life to help disseminate this philosophy among his people was that he had seen 4 of his 6 brothers die by violence, 3 of them killed by white men, including one by lynching. What my father could not know then was that of the remaining 3, including himself, only one, my Uncle Jim, would die in bed of natural causes. Northern white police were later to shoot my Uncle Oscar, and my father was himself to die by the white man's hands. It has always been my belief that I, too, will die by violence. I have done all that I can to be prepared. I was my father's 7th child. He had 3 children by a previous marriage, Ella, Earl, and Mary, who lived in Boston. He had met and married my mother in Philadelphia, where their first child, my oldest full brother, Wilfred, was born. They moved from Philadelphia to Omaha, where Hilda and then Filbert were born. I was next in line. My mother was 28 when I was born on May 19, 1925, in an Omaha hospital. And then we moved to Milwaukee, where Reginald was born. From infancy, he had some kind of hernia condition which was to handicap him physically for the rest of his life. Louise Little, my mother, who was born in Grenada in the British West Indies, looked like a white woman. Her father was white. She had straight black hair, and her accent did not sound like a Negro's. Of this white father of hers, I know nothing except her shame about it. I remember hearing her say she was glad that she had never seen him. It was, of course, because of him that I got my reddish-brown, marronite color of skin and my hair of the same. Out in the world later on, in Boston and New York, I was among the millions of Negroes who were insane enough to feel that it was some kind of that white rapist's blood that is in me. Our family stayed only briefly in Milwaukee, for my father wanted to find a place where he could raise our own food and perhaps build a business. The teaching of Marcus Garvey stressed becoming independent of the white man. We went next, for some reason, to Lansing, Michigan. My father bought a house, and soon, as had been his pattern, he was doing freelance Christian preaching in the local Negro Baptist churches. And during the week, he was roaming about spreading word of Marcus Garvey. This time, the get-out-of-town threats came from a local hate society called the Black Legion. They wore black robes instead of white. Soon, nearly everywhere my father went, Black Legionnaires were reviling him as an uppity nigger for wanting to own a store, for living outside the Lansing Negro district, for spreading unrest and dissension among the good niggers. As in Omaha, my mother was pregnant again, this time with my youngest sister. Shortly after Yvonne was born came the Nightmare Night in 1929, my earliest vivid memory. I remember being suddenly snatched awake into a frightening confusion of pistol shots and shouting and smoke and flames. My father had shouted and shot at the two white men who had set the fire and were running away. Our home was burning down around us. We were lunging and bumping and tumbling all over each other trying to escape. My mother, with the baby in her arms, just made it into the yard before the house crashed in, showering sparks. I remember we were outside in the night in our underwear, crying and yelling at clothes and houses temporarily. Then he moved us into another house on the outskirts of East Lansing. In those days, Negroes weren't allowed after dark in East Lansing proper. There's where Michigan State University is located. I related all this January 1963. I told him how East Lansing harassed us so much that we had to move again, this time 2 miles home, where I started to grow up. After the fire, I remember that my father was called in and questioned about a permit for the pistol with which he had shot at the white man who set the fire. I remember the police were always dropping by our house, shoving things around, just checking or looking for a gun. The pistol they were looking for, which they never found, and for which they wouldn't issue a permit, was sewed up inside a pillow. My father's .22 rifle and his shotgun, though, were right out in the open. Everyone had them for hunting birds and rabbits and other game. After that, my memories are of the friction between my father would beat her. It might have had something to do with the fact that my mother had a pretty good education. Where she got it, I don't know, but an educated woman, I suppose, can't resist the temptation to correct an uneducated man. Every now and then, when she would put those smooth words on him, he would grab her. My father was also belligerent toward all of the children except me. The older ones he would beat almost savagely if they broke any of his rules, and he had so many rules it was hard to know them all. Nearly all my whippings came from my mother. I actually believe that as anti-white as my father was, he was subconsciously so afflicted with the white man's brainwashing of Negroes that he inclined to favor the light ones, and I was his lightest child. Back when I was growing up, the successful Lansing Negroes were such as waiters and bootblacks. To be a janitor at some downtown store was to be highly respected. The real elite, the big shots, the voices of the race, were the waiters at the Lansing Country Club and the shoeshine boys at the state capitol. The only Negroes who had any money were the ones in the numbers racket, or who ran gambling houses, or who in some other way lived parasitically off the poorest ones, who were the masses. No Negroes were hired then by Lansing's big Oldsmobile plant or the Rio plant. The bulk of the Negroes were either on welfare or WPA, or they starved. A day was to come when our family was so poor that we would eat the whole out of a donut. But at that time, we were much better off than most town Negroes. The reason was, we raised much of our own food out there in the country where we were. We were much better off than the town Negroes who would shout as my father preached for the pie in the sky and the heaven in the hereafter, while the white man had his here on earth. I knew that the collections my father got from his preaching were mainly what fed and clothed us, and he also did other odd jobs, but still, the image of him that made me proudest was his crusading and militant campaigning with the word of Marcus Garvey. As young as I was then, I knew from what I overheard that my father was saying something that made him a tough man. I remember an old lady grinning and saying to my father, "You're scaring these white folks to death." One of the reasons I've always felt that my father favored me was that, to the best of my remembrance, it was only me that he sometimes took with him to the Garvey UNIA meetings, which he held quietly in different people's homes. There never were more than a few people at any one time, 20 at most. But that was a lot packed into someone's living room. I noticed how differently they all acted, although sometimes they were the same people who jumped and shouted in church. But in these meetings, both they and my father were more intense, more intelligent and down to earth. It made me feel the same way. I can remember hearing of Adam driven out of the garden into the caves of Europe, Africa for the Africans, Ethiopians awake. And my father would talk about how it would not be much longer before Africa would be completely run by Negroes. By black men was the phrase he always used. No one knows when the hour of Africa's redemption cometh. It is in the wind. It is coming one day. Like a storm, it will be here. I have never understood why, after hearing as much as I did of these kinds of things, I somehow never thought then of the black people in Africa. My image of Africa at the time was of naked savages, cannibals, monkeys, and tigers, and steaming jungles. My mother at this time seemed to be always working, cooking, washing, ironing, cleaning, and fussing over us 8 children. And she was usually either arguing with or not speaking to my father. One cause of friction was that she had strong ideas about what she wouldn't eat and didn't want us to eat, including pork and rabbit, both of which my father loved dearly. He was a real Georgia Negro, and he believed in eating plenty of what we in Harlem today call soul food. I've said that my mother was the one who whipped me. At least she did whenever she wasn't ashamed to let the neighbors think that she was killing me. For if she even acted as though she was about to raise her hand to me, I would open my mouth and let the world know about it. If anybody was passing by out on the road, she would either change her mind or just give me a few licks. Thinking about it now, I feel definitely that just as my father favored me for being lighter than the other children, my mother gave me more hell for the same reason. She was very light herself, but she favored the ones who were darker. Wilfred, I know, was particularly her angel. I remember that she would tell me to get out of the house and let the sun shine on you so you can get some color. She went out of her way never to let me become afflicted with a sense of color superiority. I am sure that she treated me this way partly because of how she came to be light herself. I learned early that crying out in protest could accomplish things. My older brothers and sister had started to school when sometimes they would come in and ask for a buttered biscuit or something, and my mother, impatiently, would tell them no. But I would cry out and make a fuss until I got what I wanted. I remember well how my mother asked me why I couldn't be a nice boy like Wilfred, but I would think to myself that Wilfred, for being so nice and quiet, often stayed hungry. So early in life, I had learned that if you want something, you better make some noise. Not only did we have our big garden, but we raised chickens. My father would buy some baby chicks, and my mother would raise them. We all loved chicken. That was one dish there was no argument with my father about. One thing in particular that I remember made me feel grateful toward my mother was that one day I went and asked her for my own garden. And she did let me have my own little plot. I loved it and took care of it well. I loved especially to grow peas. I was proud when we had them on our table. I would pull out the grass in my garden by hand when the first little blades came up. I would patrol the rows on my hands and knees for any worms and bugs, and I would kill and bury them. And sometimes when I had everything straight and clean for my things to grow, I would lie down on my back between 2 rows. I would gaze up in the blue sky at the clouds and all kinds of things. At 5, I, too, began to go to school along with Will. It was the Pleasant Grove School. It was 2 miles outside the city limits, and I guess there was no problem about our attending because we were the only people in the North usually would up just a few years. Correct. The white kids didn't make any great thing about us either. They called us Darky and Rastus so much that we thought those were our natural names. But they didn't think of it as an insult. It was just the way they thought about us. One afternoon in 1931, when Wilfred, Hilda, Filbert, and I came home, my mother and father were having one of their arguments. There had lately been a lot of tension around the house because of Black Legion threats. Anyway, my father had taken one of the rabbits which we were raising and ordered my mother to cook it. We raised rabbits but sold them to whites. My father had taken a rabbit from the rabbit pen. He had pulled off the rabbit's head. He was so strong, he needed no knife to behead chicken or rabbits. With one twist of his big black hands, he simply twisted off the head and threw the bleeding neck thing back at my mother's feet. My mother was crying. She started to skin the rabbit preparatory to cooking it. But my father was so angry, he slammed on out of the front door and started walking up the road toward town. It was then that my mother had this vision. She had always been a strange woman in this sense and had always had a strong intuition of things about to happen. And most of her children are the same way, I think. When something is about to happen, I can feel something, sense something. I never have known something to happen that has caught me completely off guard, except once. And that was when years later I discovered facts I couldn't believe about a man who, up until that discovery, I would gladly have given my life for. My father was well up the road when my mother ran screaming out to the porch. "Early! Early!" She screamed his name. She clutched her apron up in one hand and ran down across the yard and into the road. My father turned around. He saw her. For some reason, considering how angry he had been when he left, he waved at her. But he kept on going. She told later, my mother, that she had a vision of my father's end. All of this to the afternoon, she was not herself, crying and nervous and upset. She finished cooking a rabbit and put the whole thing in the warmer part of the black stove. When my father was not back home by our bedtime, my mother hugged and clutched us, and we felt strange, not knowing what to do because she had never acted like that. I remember waking up to the sound of my mother screaming. When I scrambled out, I saw the police in the living room. They were trying to calm her down. She had snatched on her clothes to go with them, and all of us children who were staring knew without anyone having to say it that something terrible had happened to our father. My mother was taken by the police to the hospital and to a room where a sheet was over my father in the bed, and she wouldn't look. She was afraid to look. Probably it was wise that she didn't. My father's skull on one side was crushed in, I was told later. Negroes in Lansing have always whispered that he was attacked and then laid across some tracks for a streetcar to run him over. His body was cut almost in half. He lived 2.5 hours in that condition. Negroes then were stronger than they are now, especially Georgia Negroes. Negroes born in Georgia had to be strong simply to survive. It was morning when we children at home got the word that he was dead. I was 6. I can remember a vague commotion, the house filled up with people crying, saying bitterly that the White Black Legion had finally got him. My mother was hysterical. In the bedroom, women were holding smelling salts under her nose. She was still hysterical at the funeral. I don't have a very clear memory of the funeral either. Oddly, the main thing I remember about it was that it wasn't in a church, and that surprised me, since my father was a preacher, and I had been there when he preached people's funerals in churches. But his was in a funeral home. And I remember that during the service, a big black fly came down and landed on my father's face, and Wilfred sprang up from his chair, and he shooed the fly away, and he came groping back to his chair. There were folding chairs for us to sit on, and the tears were streaming down his face. When we went by the casket, I remember that I thought it looked as if my father's strong black face had been dusted with flour, and I wished they hadn't put on such a lot of it.
The family that Earl Little left behind faced many hardships. When a life insurance policy he had carried refused to pay, claiming the death was a suicide, the family sank quickly into debt and then onto welfare. Louise Little went whatever jobs she could find, mostly housework and sewing for white families, and Wilfred, the oldest child, quit school and went to work. But there was never enough money, and by 1934, at the height of the Depression, the family was desperate. Growing fast, always hungry, Malcolm would sometimes steal food from stores in Lansing. He also began visiting friends and neighbors around dinner time, particularly a family named Johannes, who were raising a nephew called Big Boy at Malcolm's age. When Malcolm was caught stealing, he became the focus of efforts by state agencies to place Louise Little's children in foster homes. Malcolm's mother made no secret of the hatred she felt for the welfare workers. She deeply resented their frequent visits and became incensed when she discovered that they had already made initial arrangements for Malcolm to live with the Johannes. The welfare workers began to suggest to the children that their mother might be losing her mind.
It was about this time that a large, dark man from Lansing began visiting. I don't remember how or where he and my mother met. It may have been through some mutual friends. I don't remember what his profession was. In 1935 in Lansing, Negroes didn't have anything you could call a profession. But the man, big and black, looked something like my father. I can remember his name, but there's no need to mention it. He was a single man, and my mother was a widow, only 36 years old. The man was independent. Naturally, she admired that. She was having a hard time disciplining us, and a big man's presence alone would help. And if she had a man to provide, it would send the state people away forever. We all understood without ever saying much about it, or at least we had no objection. We took it in stride, even with some amusement among us, that when the man came, our mother would be all dressed up in the best that she had. She was still a good-looking woman, and she would act differently, lighthearted and laughing, as we hadn't seen her act in years. It went on for about a year, I guess, and then about 1936 and 1937, the man from Lansing jilted my mother suddenly. He just stopped coming to see her. From what I later understood, he finally backed away from taking on the responsibility of those 8 mouths to feed. He was afraid of so many of us. To this day, I can see the trap that Mother was in, saddled with all of us. But it was a terrible shock to her. It was the beginning of the end of reality for my mother. And she began to sit around and walk around talking to herself, almost as though she was unaware that we were there. It became increasingly terrifying. The state people saw her weakening. That was when they began the definiteness had all said how much they liked me and would like to have me live with them. I liked all of them too, but I didn't want to leave Wilfred. I looked up to and admired my big brother. I didn't want to leave Hilda, who was like my second mother, or Filbert. Even in our fighting, there was a feeling of brotherly union. Or Reginald, especially, who was weak with his hernia condition and who looked up to me as his big brother who looked out for him as I looked up to Wilfred. And I had nothing either against the babies, Yvonne, Wesley, and Robert. As my mother talked to herself more and more, she gradually became less responsive to us and less responsible. The house became less tidy. We began to be more unkempt. And usually now, Hilda cooked. We children watched our anchor giving way. It was something terrible that you couldn't get your hands on, yet you couldn't get away from. It was a sensing that something bad was going to happen. We younger ones leaned more and more heavily on the relative strength of Wilfred and Hilda, who were the oldest. When finally I was sent to the Johannes house, at least in the surface way, I was glad. I remember that when I left home with the state, don't let them feed him any pig. It was better in a lot of ways at the Johannes. Big Boy and I shared his room together, and we hit it off nicely. He just wasn't the same as my blood brothers. The Johannes were very religious people. Big Boy and I attended church with them. They were sanctified holy rollers now. The preachers and congregations jumped even high and shouted even louder than the Baptists I had known. They sang at the top of their lungs and swayed back and forth and cried and moaned and beat on tambourines and chanted. It was spooky, with ghosts and spirituals and haints seeming to be in the very atmosphere when finally we all came out of the church going back home. Mr. Johannes was close cronies with some of the other men who had a set rabbit hunting strategy that they had always used. Usually when a dog jumps a rabbit, and the rabbit passed the very spot where he originally was jumped, well, the old men would just sit, and I thought of a plan. I would separate from them and Big Boy, and I would go to a... It worked like magic. I began to get 3 and 4 rabbits before they got 1. The astonishing thing was that none of the old men ever figured out why. They outdid themselves, exclaiming what a sure shot I was. I was about 12 then. All I had done was to improve on their strategy, and it was the beginning of a very important lesson in life. That any time you find someone more successful than you are, especially when you're both engaged in the same business, you know they're doing something that you aren't. Suffered a complete breakdown, and the court orders were finally signed. They took her to the state mental hospital at Kalamazoo. It was 70-some miles from Lansing, about an hour and a half on the bus. A Judge McClellan in Lansing had authority over me and all my brothers and sisters. It was state children, court wards. He had the full say-so over 26 years. Later, when I was still growing up in Michigan, I would go to visit her every so often. Nothing that I can imagine could have moved me so deeply as seeing her pitiful state. In 1963, we got my mother out of the hospital, and she now lives there in Lansing with Filbert and his family. It was so much worse than if it had been a physical sickness, for which a cause might have been known, medicine given, a cure effected. Every time I visited her, when finally they led her, a case, a number, back inside from where we had been sitting together, I felt worse. My last visit, when I knew I would never come to see her again, there, was in 1952. I was 27. Visit, she had recognized him somewhat, in spots, he said. But she didn't recognize me at all. She stared at me. She didn't know who I was. Her mind, when I tried to talk, to reach her, was somewhere else. I asked, "Mama, do you know what day it is?" She said, staring, "All the people have gone." I can't describe how I felt. The woman who had brought me into the world and nursed me and advised me and chastised me and loved me didn't know me. It was as if I was trying to walk up the side of a hill of feathers. I looked at her. I listened to her talk. But there was nothing I could do. I truly believe that if ever a state social agency destroyed a family, it destroyed ours. We wanted and tried to stay together. Our home didn't have to be destroyed. But the welfare, the courts, and the doctor gave us the 1, 2, 3 punch, and ours was not the only case of this kind. I knew I wouldn't be back to see my mother again because it could make me a very vicious and dangerous person. Knowing how they had looked at us as numbers and as a case in their book, not as human beings. And knowing that my mother in there was a statistic that didn't have to be, that existed because of a society's failure, hypocrisy, greed, and lack of mercy and compassion. Hence, I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight. I have rarely talked to anyone about my mother, for I believe that I am capable of killing a person without hesitation who happened to make the wrong kind of remark about my mother. So I purposely don't make any opening for some fool to step into. Back when our family was destroyed in 1937, Wilfred and Hilda were old enough so that the state let them stay on their own in the big 4-room house that my father had built. Filbert was placed with another family in Lansing, a Mrs. Hackett, while Reginald and Wesley went to live with a family called Williams, who were friends of my mother's. And Yvonne and Robert went to live with a West Indian family named McGuire. Separated though we were, all of us maintained fairly close touch around Lansing, in school and out, whenever we could get together. Despite the artificially created separation and distance between us, we still remained very close in our feelings toward each other. Not long after this, I came into a classroom with my hat on. I did it deliberately. The teacher, who was white, ordered me to keep the hat on and to walk around and around the room until he told me to stop. That way, he said, everyone can see you. Meanwhile, we'll go on with the class for those who are here to learn something. I was still walking around when he got up from his desk and turned to the blackboard to write something on it. Everyone in the classroom was looking when at this moment I passed behind his desk, snatched up a thumbtack, and deposited it in his chair. When he turned to sit back down, I was far from the scene of the crime, circling around the rear of the room. Then he hit the tack, and I heard him holler and caught a shock when the decision came that I had been expelled. I guess I must have had some vague idea that if I didn't have to go to school, I'd be allowed to stay on with the Gohannas and wander around town, or maybe get a job if I wanted one for pocket money. But I got rocked on my heels when a state man whom I hadn't seen before came and got me at the Gohannas and took me down to court. They told me I was going to reform school. I was still 13 years old.
Malcolm was sent to live in a detention home in Mason, a small town about 12 miles from Lansing. There he became, as he called it, the mascot of the couple who ran the home, a Mr. and Mrs. Swirlin. The Swirlins were clearly impressed with Malcolm's intelligence. They gave him small jobs to do around their house, and eventually got him a job washing dishes in a local restaurant. But they often spoke disparagingly of niggers in front of him, as if he weren't there. The same way, Malcolm X wrote, people would talk freely in front of a pet canary. Instead of reform school, Malcolm became the first ward of the detention home ever to be placed in Mason Junior High School, where he was a top student and was even elected president of his 7th grade class, and where his history teacher was particularly fond of telling nigger jokes in Malcolm's presence. When Malcolm told his English teacher, whom he had regarded as a friend and advisor, that he'd like to be a lawyer one day, the instructor told him, "That's no realistic goal for a nigger. You're good with your hands. Why don't you plan on carpentry?" After this incident, Malcolm became increasingly withdrawn, especially from white people. He also began to get restless. During the summer of his 14th year, he visited his half-sister, Ella, in Boston. A commanding woman, he wrote of her. The way she sat, moved, talked, did everything, bespoke somebody who did and got exactly what she wanted. Ella had come north from Georgia with nothing, and she had worked hard and invested her savings in property. I had never been so impressed with anybody, Malcolm noted, and he was equally impressed with the excitement of life in the big city. When he finished 8th grade at Mason Junior High, he left Michigan and moved into Ella's house in the Warmbeck and Humboldt Avenue Hill section of Roxbury, Boston's largest black neighborhood. The Hill, as it was known, was considered an exclusive area where many black professionals lived: teachers, preachers, Pullman porters, bank janitors, and other members of the black community's elite. Ella told Malcolm to enjoy himself, to get to know the neighborhood, and he began to roam, late and wide, through the streets of Boston.
Bronson, who obviously didn't work anywhere, completely entranced me. I couldn't get over marveling how their hair was straight and shiny like white men's hair. Ella told me this was called a conch. I had never tasted a sip of liquor, never even smoked a cigarette, and here I saw little black children 10 and 12 years old shooting craps, playing cards, fighting, getting grown-ups to put a penny or a nickel on their number for them, things like that. Yep. Every night as I lay in bed, I turned these new words over in my mind. It was shocking to me that in town, especially after dark, you'd occasionally see a white girl and a Negro man strolling arm in arm along the sidewalk, and mixed couples drinking in the neon-lighted bars, not slipping off to some dark corner, as in Lansing. I wanted to find a job myself, to surprise Ella. One afternoon, something told me to go inside a pool room whose window I was looking through. I had looked through that window many times. I wasn't yearning to play pool. In fact, I had never held a cue stick. But I was drawn by the sight of the cool-looking cat standing around inside, bending over the big green felt-top tables, making bets and shooting the bright-colored balls into the holes. As I stared through the window this particular afternoon, something made me decide to venture inside and talk to a dark, stubby, conch-headed fellow who racked up balls for the pool players, whom I'd heard called Shorty. One day, he had come outside and seen me standing there, and he said, "Hi, Red." So that made me figure he was friendly. As inconspicuously as I could, I slipped inside the door and around the side of the pool room, avoiding people, and on to the back where Shorty was filling an aluminum can with powder the pool players dust on their hands. "Male country," he'd say, laughing. "Cat's legs were so long, his pants so short, his knees showed, and his head looked like a briar patch." But that afternoon, Shorty didn't let it show in his face how country I'd appeared when I told him I'd appreciate it if he'd tell me how could somebody go about getting a job like his. "If you mean racking up balls," said Shorty, "I don't know no pool joints around here needing anybody." "You mean you just want any slaves you can find?" A slave meant work, a job. He asked me what kind of work I had done. I told him that I'd washed restaurant dishes in Mason, Michigan. He nearly dropped that powder can. "My homeboy, man, give me some skin. I'm from Lansing." I never told Shorty, and he never suspected that he was about 10 years older than I. He took us to be about the same age. First, I would have been embarrassed to tell him. Later, I just never bothered. Shorty had dropped out of first-year high school in Lansing, lived a while with an uncle and aunt in Detroit, and had spent the last 6 years living with his cousin in Roxbury. But when I mentioned the names of Lansing people and places, he remembered many, and pretty soon we sounded as if we had been raised in the same block. I could sense Shorty's genuine gladness, and I don't have to say how lucky I felt to find a friend as hip as he obviously was. "Man, this is a swinging town if you dig it," Shorty said. "You're my homeboy. I'm going to school you to the happenings." I stood there and grinned like a fool. "You got to go anywhere now?" "Well, stick around until I get off." One thing I liked immediately about Shorty was his frankness. When I told him where I am, the Hill Negroes, he thought a sister who gave me a pad, not charging me rent, not even running me out to find some slave, couldn't be all bad. Shorty's slave in the pool room, he said, was just to keep ends together while he learned his horn. A couple of years before, he'd hit the numbers and bought a saxophone. "Got it right here in the closet now for my lesson tonight." Shorty was taking lessons with some other studs, and he intended one day to organize his own small band. "There's a lot of bread to be made gigging right around here in Roxbury," Shorty explained to me. "I don't dig joining some big band one night and all over just to say I played with Count or Duke or somebody." I thought that was smart. I wished I had studied a horn, but I'd never been exposed to one. Through the afternoon, Shorty introduced me to players and loungers. "My homeboy," he'd say. "He's looking for a slave if you hear anything." They all said they'd look out. At 7 o'clock, when the night ball racket came on, Shorty told me he had to hurry to a saxophone lesson. But before he left, he held out to me the $6 or $7 he had collected that day in nickel and dime tips. "You got enough bread, homeboy?" I was okay, I told him. I had $2. But Shorty made me take 3 more. "A little fattening for your pocket," he said. Before we went out, he opened his saxophone case and showed me the horn. It was gleaming brass against the green velvet, an alto sax. He said, "Keep cool, homeboy, and come back tomorrow. Some of the cats will turn you up a slave."
Malcolm's first big city job was shining shoes at the Roseland State Ballroom. Besides dancers and drunks, he shined the shoes of Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Cootie Williams, Lionel Hampton, and many other famous musicians who played the Roseland. He also learned his first hustles there, setting up white customers with black whores and selling liquor and reefers on the side. Shorty showed Malcolm the wonders of buying on credit. Malcolm bought his first zoot suit, and when his hair grew long enough, Shorty decided it was time for Malcolm's first conch.
I took the little list of ingredients he had printed out for me and went to a grocery store where I got a can of Red Devil Lye, 2 eggs, and 2 medium-sized white potatoes. Then in a drugstore near the pool room, I asked for a large jar of Vaseline, a large bar of soap, a large tooth comb, and a fine tooth comb, one of those rubber hoses with a metal spray head, a rubber apron, and a pair of gloves. "Gonna lay on that first conch?" the drugstore man asked me. I proudly told him, grinning, "Right." Shorty paid $6 a week for a room in his cousin's shabby apartment. His cousin wasn't at home. "It's like the pad's mine. He spends so much time with his woman," Shorty said. "Now, you watch me." He peeled the potatoes and thin-sliced them into a quart-sized mason fruit jar, then started stirring them with a wooden spoon as he gradually poured in a little over half the can of lye. "Never use a metal spoon. The lye will turn it black," he told me. A jelly-like, starchy-looking glop resulted from the lye and potatoes, and Shorty broke in the 2 eggs, stirring real fast. "There." He made me sit down, and he tied the string of the new rubber in tightly around my neck and combed up my bush of hair. Then from the big Vaseline jar, I took a hand for the scalp. He also thickly Vaseline my neck, ears, and forehead. "When I get to wash stinging," Shorty warned me, washing his hands and then pulling on rubber gloves and tying on his own rubber apron. "You always got to remember that any Congolese was watered, my nose was running. I couldn't stand it any longer. I bolted to the wash basin. I was cursing Shorty with every name I could think of when he got the spray going and started soap lathering my head. He lathered and spray rinsed maybe 10 or 12 times, each time gradually closing the hot water faucet until the rinse was cold, and that helped some. "You feel any stinging spots?" "No," I managed to say. My knees were trembling. "Sit back down, then. I think we got it all out okay." The flame came back as Shorty, with a thick towel, started drying my conch. When Shorty let me stand up and see in the mirror, my hair hung down in limp, damp strands. My scalp still flamed, but not as badly. I could bear it. He draped the towel around my shoulders over my rubber apron and began again Vaselining my hair. I could feel him combing, straight back, first the big comb, then the fine-toothed one. Then he was using a razor very delicately on the back of my neck, and finally shaping the sideburns. My first view in the mirror blotted out the hurting. I'd seen some pretty conchs, but when it's the first time on your own head, the transformation after a lifetime of kinks is staggering. The mirror reflected Shorty behind me. We both were grinning and sweating, and on top of my head was this thick, smooth sheen of shining red hair, real red, as straight as any white man's. How ridiculous I was. Stupid enough to stand there, simply lost in admiration of my hair now looking white, reflected in the mirror in Shorty's room. I vowed that I'd never again be without a conch, and I never was for many years. This was my first really big step towards self-degradation. When I endured all that pain, literally inferior, and white people are superior, that they will even violate and mutilate their God-created bodies to try to look pretty by white standards.
Malcolm moved easily into the hip city life of the Boston ghetto. He smoked the jive, drank the liquor, smoked the reefers and cigarettes, and he learned to dance. Lindy hopping was the craze of the day, and Malcolm became a Lindy hopping star. At 16, he acquired the ultimate black hipster status symbol, a white woman. Sophia, as he called her, it was not her real name, was vague about her background, but she was clearly well off and infatuated with black men, especially Malcolm. For months, he paraded her through the black bars and clubs. Through his sister Ella, Malcolm landed a new job selling sandwiches on the Yankee Clipper, the train that ran from Boston to New York. And in New York, he discovered Harlem, the fabulous nightlife that dwarfed what he had known in Boston, the hookers, pimps, and con artists who made up what Malcolm called the Technicolor Bazaar, that stretched along Lenox between 7th and 8th Avenues, the Apollo Theater, and the Savoy Ballroom, the bar at the Braddock Hotel, where the great black musicians congregated, Dizzy Gillespie, Billy Eckstine, Billie Holiday, Ella Fitzgerald, Dinah Washington. Malcolm dreamed of becoming part of it, and shortly after his 17th birthday, he made the move. He found a job in the center of the action as a day waiter at Small's Paradise, one of Harlem's hippest bars.
Every day in Small's Paradise Bar was fascinating to me. And from a Harlem point of view, I couldn't have been in a more educational situation. Some of the ablest of New York's black hustlers took a liking to me, and knowing that I was still green by their terms, soon began in a paternal way to straighten Red out. Hold still a minute. He went over me with one of those yellow tape measures and jotted figures in his notebook. When I came to work the next afternoon, one of the bartenders handed me this 40 Thieves gang. That was the gang of organized boosters who would deliver to order in one day, COD, any kind of garment you desired. You would pay about 1/3 the store's price. Plainclothes detectives soon were quietly identified to me by a nod, a wink. Knowing the law in the area was elementary for the hustlers, and like them in time I would learn to sense the presence of any police types. In late 1942, Each of the military services had their civilian dress eyes and ears picking up anything of interest to them, such as hustles being used to avoid the draft, or who hadn't registered, or hustles that were being worked on servicemen. Longshoremen, or fences for them, would come into the bar selling guns, cameras, perfumes, watches, and the like, stolen from the shipping docks. These Negroes got what white longshoremen thievery left over. Merchant marine sailors often brought in foreign items, bargains, and the best marijuana cigarettes to be had were made of the ganja and kiska that merchant sailors smuggled in from Africa and Persia. In the daytime, whites were given a guarded treatment. Whites who came at night got a better reception. The several Harlem nightclubs they patronized were geared to entertain and jive the night white crowd to get their money. And with so many law agencies guarding the morals of servicemen, any of them that came in, and a lot did, were given what they asked for, and were spoken to if they spoke, and that was all, unless someone knew them as natives of Harlem. What I was learning was the hustling society's first rule, that you never trusted anyone outside of your own closed-mouthed circle, and that you selected with time and care before you made any intimates even among these. The bartenders would let me know which among the regular customers were mostly fronts, which really had something going, which were really in the underworld with downtown police or political connections, which really handled some money, and which were making it from day to day, which were the real gamblers, and which had just hit a little luck, and which ones never to run afoul of in any way. The latter were extremely well known about Harlem, and they were feared and respected. It was known that if upset, they would break open your head and think nothing of it. These were old-timers, not to be confused with the various hot-headed, wild young hustlers out trying to make a name for themselves for being crazy with a pistol trigger or a knife. The old heads that I'm talking about were such as Black Sammy, Bub Hewlett, King Padmore, and West Indian Archie. Most of these tough ones had worked as strong-arm men for Dutch Schultz when he had muscled into the Harlem numbers industry after white gangsters had awakened to the fortunes being made in what they had previously considered nigger pennies, and the numbers game was referred to by the white racketeers as nigger pool. Those tough Negroes' heyday had been before the big 1931 Seabury investigation that started Dutch Schultz on the way out, until his career ended with his 1934 assassination. I heard stories of how they have persuaded people with lead pipes, wet cement, baseball bats, brass knuckles, fists, feet, and blackjacks. Nearly every one of them had done some time and had come back on the scene and since had worked as top runners for the biggest bankers who specialized in large bettors. There seemed to be an understanding that these Negroes and the tough black cops never clashed. I guess both knew that someone would die. They had some bad black cops in Harlem, too. The four horsemen that worked Sugar Hill, I remember the worst one had freckles. There was a tough quartet. The biggest, blackest, worst cop of them all in Harlem was the West Indian Brisbane. Negroes crossed the street to avoid him when he walked his 125th Street and 7th Avenue beat. When I was in prison, someone brought me a story that Brisbane had been shot to death by a scared, nervous young kid who hadn't been up from the South long enough to realize how bad Brisbane was. The world's most unlikely pimp was Cadillac Drake. He was shiny, bald-headed, built like a football. He used to call his huge belly the Chippy's Playground. Cadillac had a string of about a dozen of the stringiest, scrawniest black and white street prostitutes in Harlem. Just about the complete opposite of Cadillac was the young, smooth, independent acting pimp, Sammy the Pimp. Sam and I became in time each other's closest friend. Sammy was from Kentucky, was a cool, collected expert in his business, and his business, black and white women out making his living. But Sammy's women, who would come in the small sometimes, fat pimp, we called Dollar Bill. He loved to flash his Kansas City roll, probably 50 $1 bills folded with a 20 on the inside and a $100 bill on the outside. We always wondered what Dollar Bill would do if someone ever stole his $100 cover. A man who, in his prime, could have stolen Dollar Bill's whole roll blindfolded was threadbare, comic old Few Clothes. Few Clothes had been one of the best pickpockets in Harlem back when the white people swarmed up every night in the 1920s. But then during the Depression, he had gnarled so that it made people uncomfortable to look at them. Rain, sleet, or snow, every afternoon about 6, Few Clothes would be at Smalls, telling tall tales about the old days. And it was one of the day's rituals for one or another regular customer to ask the bartender to give him drinks, and me to feed him. My heart goes out to all of us who were in those afternoons at Smalls and acted our scene with Few Clothes. I wish you could have seen him, pleasantly high with drinks, take his seat with dignity, no begging, not on anybody's welfare, and open his napkin and study the day's menu that I gave him and place his order. I'd tell the cooks it was for Few Clothes and he'd get the best in the house. I'd go back and serve it as though he were a millionaire. Many times since, I've thought about it and what it really meant. In one sense, we were huddled in there, bonded together in seeking security and warmth and comfort from each other, and we didn't know it. All of us who might have probed space or cured cancer or built industries were instead black victims of the white man's American social system. In another sense, the tragedy of the once master pickpocket made him, for those brother old-timer hustlers, a there but for the grace of God symbol. To wolves who were still able to catch some rabbits, it had meaning of permanence. Inevitably, I got a nickname that would identify me beyond any confusion with two other red Compton well-known Reds who were around. I had met them both. In fact, later on I'd worked with them both. One, St. Louis Red, was a professional armed robber. When I was sent to New York City jewel robbery. The other was Chicago Red. We became good buddies, a nightclub comedian. I don't see any reason why old Chicago Red would mind me telling that he is Red Fox. Anyway, before long my nickname happened. Just when, I don't know, but people, knowing I was from Michigan, would ask me what city. Since most New Yorkers had never heard of Lansing, I would say Detroit. Gradually, I began to be called Detroit Red, and it stuck. One afternoon in early 1943, before the regular 6 o'clock crowd had gathered, a black soldier sat drinking by himself at one of my tables. He must have been there an hour or more. He looked dumb and pitiful and just up from the deep south. The fourth or fifth drink I served this soldier, wiping the table, I bent over close and asked him if he wanted a woman. I knew better. It wasn't only Small's Paradise Law, it was the law of every tavern that wanted to stay in Terry. Some had lost their state or city licenses. I played right into. He acted so grateful he even put on an extreme southern accent. And I gave him the phone number of one of my best friends among the prostitutes where I lived. But something felt wrong. I gave the fellow a half hour to get there, and then I telephoned. I didn't even bother to go back out to the bar. I just went straight to Charlie Small's office. I just did something, Charlie, I said. I don't know why I did it, and I told him. Charlie looked at me. I wish you hadn't done that, Red. We both knew what he meant. When the West Indian plainclothes detective Joe Baker came in, I was other detectives who, like Joe Baker, sometimes dropped in at Smalls. Two things were in my favor. I'd never given the police any trouble, and when that black spy soldier had tried to tip me, I had waved it away, telling him I was just doing him a favor. They must have agreed that Joe Baker should just scare me. I didn't know enough to be aware that I wasn't taken to the desk and booked. Joe Baker took me back inside of the precinct building into a small room. In the next room, we could hear somebody getting whipped. Whop! Whop! He'd cry out, "Please! Oh, please don't beat my face! That's how I make my living!" I knew that it was some pimp. Whop! Whop! Please! Please! More bitter than getting fired, I was barred from Smalls. I could understand. Be my friend in need. He put word on the wire for me to come over to his place. I'd never been there. His place seemed to me a small palace. Various numbers controllers, Smalls regulars, had offered me jobs as a runner, but that suits. Peddling reefers, Sammy and I pretty soon agreed, was the best thing. It was a run had any knack at all with people. Both Sam and I knew some merchant musicians also used the heavier narcotics if I later wanted to graduate to them. That would be more risk enough to make anything. I'd been around long enough either to know or to spot instinctively most regular detectives and cops, though not the narcotics people. And among the Smalls veteran hustler regulars, I had a variety of potentially helpful contacts. This was important because just as Sammy could get me supplied with marijuana, a large facet of any hustler's success was knowing where he could get help when he needed it. Later that same night, I knocked at his door and gave him back his money and asked him if I could lend him some. I'd gone straight from Sammy's to a supplier he had mentioned. I got just a small amount of marijuana, and I got some of the paper to roll up my own sticks. I was able to make enough of them so that after selling them to musicians I knew at the Braddock Hotel, I could pay back Sammy and have enough profit to be in business. And those musicians, when they saw their buddy and their fan in business, my man, Crazy Red. I kept turning over my profit, increasing my supplies, and I sold this. This was a fortune to a 17-year-old Negro. I felt for the first time in my life that great feeling of free. Suddenly now, I was the peer of the other young hustlers I had admired. Around Harlem, the narcotics squad detectives didn't take long to find out I was selling reefers, and occasionally one of them would follow me. Many a peddler was in jail because he had been caught with the evidence on his person. I figured a way to avoid that. The law specified that if the evidence wasn't actually in your possession, you couldn't be arrested. Hollowed-out shoe heels, fake hat linings, these things were old stuff to the detectives. I carried about 50 sticks in a small package inside my coat, under my armpit, keeping my arm flat against my side. Moving about, I kept my eyes open. If anybody looked suspicious, I'd quickly cross the street or go through a door or turn a corner, loosening my arm enough to let the package drop. At night, when I usually did my selling, any suspicious person wouldn't be likely to see the trick. If I decided I had been mistaken, I'd go back and get my sticks. However, I lost many a stick this way. Sometimes I knew I had frustrated a detective, and I kept out of the courts. One morning, though, I came in and found signs that my room had been entered. I knew it had been detectives. I'd heard too many times how if they couldn't find any evidence, they would plant some. where you would never find it, then they'd come back in and find it. I didn't even have to think twice what to do. I packed my few belongings and never looked back. When I went to sleep again, it was in another room. It was then that I began carrying a little .25 automatic. I got it for some reefers from an addict who I knew had stolen it somewhere. I carried it pressed under my belt right under the center of my back. Someone had told me that the cops never hit there in a routine patting down, and unless I knew who I was with, I never allowed myself to get caught in any crush of people. The narcotics cops had been known to rush up and get their hands on you and plant evidence while searching. I felt that as long as I kept on the go and in it, I had a good chance. I don't know now what my real thoughts were about carrying the pistol, but I imagine I felt that I wasn't going to get put away if somebody tried framing me in any situation that I could help. I sold less than before because of having to be so careful consumed so much time. Every now and then on a hunch, I'd move to another room. I told nobody but Sammy where I slept. Finally, it was on the wire that the Harlem Narcotics Squad had me on its special list. Now, every other day or so, usually in some public place, they would flash the badge and search me. But I'd tell them at once, loud enough for others standing about to hear me, that I had nothing on me and I didn't want to get anything planted on me. Then they wouldn't, because Harlem already thought little enough of the law, and they did have to be careful that some crowd of Negroes would not intervene roughly. Negroes were starting to get very tense in Harlem. One could almost smell trouble ready to break out, as it did very soon. But it was really tough on me then. I was having to hide my sticks in various places near where I was selling. I'd put 5 sticks in an empty cigarette pack and drop the empty-looking pack by a lamppost or behind a garbage can or a box. And I'd first tell my customers to pay me, and then where to pick up. But my regular customers didn't go for that. You couldn't expect a well-known musician to go grubbing behind a garbage can. So I began to pick up some of the street trade, the people you could see looked high. I collected a number of empty Red Cross bandage boxes and used them for drops. That worked pretty good. But the Middle Harlem Narcotics Force found so many ways to harass me that I had to change my area. I moved down to Lower Harlem around 110th Street. There were more reefer smokers around there, but these were a cheaper type. This is the worst of the ghetto, the poorest people, the ones who in every ghetto kept themselves narcotized to keep from having to face their miserable existence. I didn't last long down there either. I lost too much for my product. After I sold to some of those reefer smokers who had the instincts of animals, they followed me and learned the pattern. They dart out of a doorway, I'd drop my stuff, and they would be on like a chicken on corn. When you become an animal, a vulture in the ghetto, as I had become, you enter a world of animals and vultures. It becomes truly the survival of only the fittest. Soon I found myself borrowing little stakes from Sammy, from some of the musicians, enough to buy supplies, enough to keep high myself, enough sometimes just to eat. Then Sammy gave me an idea. Red, you still got your old railroad identification? I did have it. They hadn't taken it back. Well, why don't you use it to make a few runs until the heat cools? He was right. I found that if you walked up and showed a railroad line's employee identification card, the conductor, even a real cracker if you approached him right, not begging, would just wave you aboard. And when he came around, he would punch you one of those little coach seat slips to ride wherever the train went. The idea came to me that this way I could travel all over the East Coast selling reefers among my friends who were on tour with their bands. I had the New Haven identification. I worked a couple of weeks for other railroads to get their identification, and then I was set. In New York, I rolled and packed a great quantity of sticks and sealed them into jars. It came out perfectly. If you had to go home on some family business, I don't give Negro credit for having sense enough to fool them. Now my friends were playing red. I went home. In the sticks, hell, my man, oh, that apple reefers. Nobody had ever heard of it. I followed each bands knew the other bands' one-nighter touring schedules. When I ran out of supplies, I'd return to New York and I'd load up, then hit the road again. Auditoriums or gymnasiums all lighted up, the band's chartered bus outside, the dressed-up, excited local dancers pouring in. At the door, I'd announce that I was some bandman's brother. In most cases, they thought I was one of the musicians. Throughout the dance, I'd show the country folks some plain and fancy lindy hopping. Sometimes I'd stay overnight in a town. Sometimes I'd ride the band's bus to the next stop. Sometimes back in New York, I would stay a while. Things had cooled down. Word was around that I had left town, and the narcotics squad was satisfied with that. In some of the small towns, people thinking I was with the band even mobbed me for autographs. Once in Buffalo, my suit was nearly torn off. My brother Reginald was waiting for me one day when I pulled into New York. The day before, his merchant ship had put into port over in New Jersey. Thinking I still worked at Small's, Reginald had gone there, and the bartenders had directed him to Sammy, who put him up. It felt good to see my brother. It was hard to believe that he was once the little kid who tagged after me. Reginald now was almost 6 feet tall, but still a few inches shorter than me. His complexion was darker than mine, but he had greenish eyes and a white streak in his hair, which was otherwise dark reddish, something like mine. I took Reginald everywhere, introducing him. Studying my brother, I liked him. He was a lot more self-possessed than I had been at 16. I didn't have a room right at the time, but I had some money, so did Reginald, and we checked into the St. Nicholas Hotel on Sugar Hill. It has since been torn down. Reginald and I talked all night about the Lansing years, about our family. I told him things about our father and mother that he couldn't remember. Then Reginald filled me in on our brothers and sisters. Wilfred was a trade instructor at Wilberforce University. Hilda, still in Lansing, was talking of getting married, so was Filbert. Reginald and I were the next two in line, and Yvonne, Wesley, and Robert were still in Lansing in school. Reginald and I laughed about Filbert, who the last time I had seen him had gotten deeply religious. He wore one of those round straw hats. Reginald's ship was in for about a week getting some kind of repairs on its engines. I was pleased to see that Reginald, though he said little about it, admired my living by my wits. Reginald dressed a little too loudly, I thought. I got a reefer customer of mine to get him a more conservative overcoat and suit. I told Reginald what I had learned, that in order to get something, you had to look as though you already had something. Before Reginald left, I urged him to leave the Merchant Marine and I would help him get started in Harlem. I must have felt that having my kid brother around me would be a good thing. Then there would be two people I could trust. Sammy was the other. Reginald was cool. At his age, I would have been willing to run behind the train to get to New York and to Harlem. But Reginald, when he left, said, I'll think about it. Not long after Reginald left, I dragged out the wildest zoot suit in New York. This was 1943. The Boston Draft Board had written me at Ella's, and when they had no results there, had notified the New York Draft Board, and in care of Sammy, I received Uncle Sam's greetings. In those days, only 3 things in the world scared me: jail, a job, and the army. I had about 10 days before I was to show up at the induction center. I went right to work. The Army intelligence soldiers, those black spies in civilian clothes, hung around in Harlem with their ears open for the white man downtown. I knew exactly where to start dropping the word. I started noising around that I was frantic to join the Japanese Army. When I sensed that I had the ears of the spies, I would talk and act high and crazy. A lot of Harlem hustlers actually had reached that state, as I would later. It was inevitable when one had gone long enough on heavier and heavier narcotics and under the steadily tightening vice of the hustling life. I'd snatch out and read my greetings aloud to make certain they heard who I was and when I'd report downtown. This was probably the only time my real name was ever heard in Harlem in those days. The day I went down there, I costumed like an actor. With my wild zoot suit, I wore the yellow knob-toe shoes, and I frizzled my hair up into a reddish bush of conch. I went in, skipping and tipping, and I thrust my tattered greetings at the reception desk's white soldier. Crazy, oh, daddy-o, get me moving. I can't wait to get in that brown. Very likely that soldier hasn't recovered from me yet. They had their wire on me from uptown, all right. They still put me through the line. In that big starting room were 40 or 50 other prospective inductees. The room had fallen vacuum quiet with me running my mouth a mile a minute, talking nothing but slang. I was going to fight on all fronts. I was going to be a general, man, before I got done. Such talk as that. Most of them were white, of course. The tender-looking ones appeared ready to run from me. Some others had that vinegary, worst kind of nigger look, and a few were amused seeing me as the Harlem jigaboo archetype. Also amused were some of the room's 10 or 12 Negroes. But the stony-faced rest of them looked as if they were ready to sign up to go off killing somebody. They would have liked to start with me. The line moved along. Pretty soon, stripped to my shorts, I was making my eager-to-join comments in the medical examination rooms. And everybody in the white coats that I saw had 4F in his eyes. I stayed in the line longer than I expected before they siphoned me off. One of the white coats accompanied me around a turning hallway. I knew we were on the way to a head shrinker, the Army psychiatrist. The receptionist there was a Negro nurse. I remember she was in her early 20s and not bad to look at. She was one of those Negro firsts. Negroes know what I'm talking about. Back then, the white man during the war was so pressed for personnel that he began letting some Negroes put down their buckets and mops and dust rags and use a pencil or sit at some desk or hold some 25-cent title. You couldn't read the Negro press for the big pictures of smug black firsts. Somebody was inside with the psychiatrist. I didn't even have to put on any act for this black girl. She was already sick of me. When finally a buzz came at her desk, she didn't send me, she went in. I knew what she was doing. She was going to make clear in advance what she thought of me. This is still one of the black man's big troubles today. Some of those so-called upper-class Negroes are so busy trying to impress on the white man that they are different from those others, that they can't see that they are only helping the white man to keep his low opinion of all Negroes. And then, with her prestige in the clear, she came out and nodded to me to go in. I must say this for that psychiatrist. He tried to be objective and professional in his manner. He sat there and doodled with his blue pencil on the tablet, listening to me spiel to him for 3 or 4 minutes before he got a word in. His tact was quiet questions. to get at why I was so anxious. I didn't rush him. I circled and hedged, watching him closely, to let him think he was pulling what he wanted out of me. I kept jerking around and backward as though somebody might be listening. I knew I was going to send him back to the books to figure out what kind of case I was. Suddenly, I sprang up and peeped under both doors, the one I'd entered and another that probably was a closet, and then I bent and whispered fast in his ear, "Daddy-o, now, you and me, we're from up north here, so don't you tell nobody. I want to get sent down south. Organize them nigger soldiers, you dig? Steal us some guns and kill up some crackers." That psychiatrist's blue pencil dropped, and his professional manner fell off in all directions. He stared at me as if I were a snake's egg hatching, fumbling for his red pencil. I knew I had him. I was going back out past Miss First when he said, "That will be all." The 4th card came to me in the mail, and I never heard from the Army anymore and never bothered to ask why I was rejected.
Malcolm's career as a traveling reefer salesman came to an abrupt end when he pulled a gun on another railroad worker in a poker game dispute at Grand Central Station. He was blackballed by the railroads and banned from the station by the police. Back on the streets of Harlem, looking for a hustle, Malcolm turned to armed robbery. He keyed himself up for jobs with drugs and stayed high the rest of the time to keep from getting nervous. Sometimes he worked alone, sometimes with Sammy the pimp. Reginald came to town again, and this time Malcolm convinced him to stay. They got an apartment together, and Malcolm proudly showed his little brother around, introducing him to his famous musician friends, taking him to after-hours clubs like Creole Bill's, Jimmy's Chicken Shack, and Dickie Wells. After the rest of New York had closed for the night, these spots would still be jumping, packed tight with white people out to get a taste of Harlem. Malcolm was playing the numbers heavily at this time, placing his bets with West Indian Archie, one of Harlem's legendary bad guys, a former strong-arm for Dutch Schultz. Archie was a natural for the numbers racket. He had a photographic memory, so he never had to write the numbers down. The police would never catch Archie carrying betting slips. Forced to lay low following a robbery attempt that went bad, Malcolm became a steerer for a Harlem madam, picking up and delivering her wealthy white clientele, many of them rich, influential, famous men who wanted bizarre sexual experiences with black hookers. Malcolm came to know the flesh trade well. He also steered occasionally for a white lesbian who ran a stable of black male prostitutes catering exclusively to white women. Malcolm's steady diet of cocaine, opium, alcohol, and marijuana began to take its toll. He caught colds that he couldn't shake. He stayed high continually, living in a dream world. But it was about to turn into a nightmare that not even the drugs could obscure.
Up in the Bronx, a Negro held up some Italian racketeers in a floating crap game. I heard about it on the wire. Whoever did it, aside from being a fool, was said to be a tall, light-skinned Negro masked with a woman's stocking. Up in Fat Man's bar on the hill overlooking the polo grounds, I had just gone into a telephone booth. Everyone in the bar, all over Harlem in fact, was drinking up excited about the news that Branch Rickey, the Brooklyn Dodgers owner, had just signed Jackie Robinson to play in Major League Baseball with the Dodgers farm team in Montreal, which would place the time in the fall of 1945. Early in the afternoon, I had collected from West Indian Archie for a 50-cent combination bet. He had paid me $300 right out of his pocket. I was telephoning Gene Parks. Jean was one of the most beautiful women who ever lived in Harlem. She once sang with Sarah Vaughan and the Blue Bonnets, a quartet that sang with Earl Hines. For a long time, Jean and I had enjoyed a stand-in friendly deal that we'd go out and celebrate when either of us hit the numbers. Since my last hit, Jean had treated me twice, and we laughed on the phone, glad that now I'd treat her to a night out. We arranged to go to a 52nd Street nightclub to hear Billie Holiday, who had been on the road and was just back in New York. As I hung up, I spotted the two lean, tough-looking paisanos gazing in at me cooped up in the booth. Didn't need any intuition, and I had no gun. A cigarette case was the only thing in my pocket. I started easing my hand down into my pocket to try bluffing, and one of them snatched open the door. They were dark olive, swarthy-featured Italians. I had my hand down into my pocket. "Come outside, we'll hold court," one said. At that moment, a cop walked through the front door. The two thugs slipped out. I never in my life have been so glad to see a cop. I was still shaking when I got to the apartment of my friend Sammy the Pimp. He told me that not long before, West Indian Archie had been there looking for me. Sometimes recalling all of this, I don't know, to tell the truth, how I am alive to tell it today. They say God takes care of fools and babies. I've so often thought that Allah was watching over me. Through all of this time in my life, I really was dead, mentally dead. I just didn't know that I was. Anyway, to kill time, Sammy and I sniffed some of his cocaine until the time came to pick up Gene Parks to go down and hear Lady Day. Sammy's having told me about West Indian Archie looking for me didn't mean a thing. Not right then. There was the knocking at the door. Sammy, lying on his bed in pajamas and bathrobe, called, "Who?" When West Indian Archie answered, Sammy slid the round, two-sided shaving mirror under the bed with what little of the cocaine powder, or crystals actually, was left, and I opened the door. "Red, I want my money." A 32-20 is a funny kind of gun. It's bigger than a 32. It's not as big as a 38. I had faced down some dangerous Negroes, but no one who wasn't ready to die messed with West Indian Archie. I couldn't believe it. He truly scared me. I was so incredulous at what was happening, it was hard to form words with my brain and my mouth. "Man, what's the beef?" West Indian Archie said he thought I was trying something when I told him I'd hit, but he paid me $300 until he could double-check his written betting slips. And as he claimed, but another. "Man, you're crazy." I talked fast. I'd seen out of the corner of my eye Sammy's hand easing under his pillow where he kept his Army .45. "Archie, smart a man as you're supposed to be, you'd pay somebody who hadn't hit?" The 32-20 moved, and Sammy froze. West Indian Archie told him, "I ought to shoot you right through the ear." I must have shaken my head. "I'll give you until 12 o'clock tomorrow." And he put his hands. Money wasn't the problem. I still had about $200 of it. Had money been the issue, Sammy could have made up the difference. If it wasn't in his pocket, his women could quickly have raised it. West Indian Archie himself, for that matter, would have loaned me $300 if I'd asked him. As many thousands of dollars of mine as he'd gotten 10% of. Once, in fact, when he'd heard I was broke, he had looked me up and handed me some money and grunted, "Stick." The issue was the position which his action had put us both into. For Hustler in our sidewalk jungle world, face and honor were important. No hustler could have it known that he'd been hyped, meaning outsmarted or made a fool of, and worse, A hustler could never afford to have it demonstrated that he could be bluffed, that he could be frightened by a threat, that he lacked nerve. West Indian Archie knew that some young hustlers rose in stature in our world when they somehow hoodwinked older hustlers, then put it on the wire for everyone to hear. He believed I was trying that. In turn, I knew he would be protecting his stature by broadcasting all over the wire his threat to me. Because of this code, in my time in Harlem, I'd personally known a dozen hustlers who threatened left town disgraced. Once the wire had it, any retreat by either of us was unthinkable. The wire would be awaiting the report of the showdown. Known of at least another dozen showdowns in which one took the dead on arrival ride to the morgue and the other went to prison for manslaughter or the electric chair for murder. He let me hold his .32. My guns were at my apartment. I put the .32 in my pocket with my hand on it and walked out. I couldn't stay out of sight. I had to show up at all of my usual haunts. I was glad that Reginald Town, he might have tried protecting me, and I didn't want him shot in the head by West Indian Archie. It was just about time for me to go and pick up Jean Parks to go downtown to see Billie Holiday at the Onyx Club. So much was swirling in my head. I thought about telephoning her and calling it off, making some excuse. But I knew that running now was the worst thing I could do. So I went on and picked up Jean at her place. We took a taxi down to 52nd Street. Billie at the microphone had just finished a number when she saw Jean and me. Her white gown glittered under the spotlight. Her face had that coppery Indianish look, and her hair was in that trademark ponytail. For her next number, she did the one. When her set was done, Billie came over to our table. She and Jean, who hadn't seen each other in a long time, hugged each other. Billie sensed something wrong with me. She knew that I was always high, but she knew me well enough to see that something else was wrong, and she asked me in her customary profane language what was the matter with me. In my own foul vocabulary of those days, I pretended to be without a care, so she let it drop. We had a picture taken by the club photographer that night. The three of us were sitting close together. That was the last time I ever saw Lady Day. She's dead. Dope and heartbreak stopped that heart as big as a barn in that sound and style that no one successfully copies. Lady Day sang with the soul of Negroes from the centuries of sorrow and oppression. What a shame that proud, fine black woman never lived where the true greatness of the black race was appreciated. In the Onyx Club men's room, I sniffed a little pint from Sammy. Jean and I, riding back up to Harlem in a cab, decided to have another drink. She had no idea what was happening when she suggested one of my images, and I said, okay. By the time we'd had the drink, I was so high that I asked Jean to take a cab on home, and she did. I never have seen Jean again either. Like a fool, I didn't leave the bar. I stayed there, sitting again. But it's a good thing I was then. I'm positive if I'd seen West Indian Archie come in, I'd have shot to kill.